All right, so today we're diving into a book that's, well, it's kind of a classic, right? How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney.
Yeah, this one's a big one. It's definitely had a huge impact.
For sure. And Angela Davis, the Angela Davis, she wrote the foreword to this edition.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And she calls Rodney like the perfect example of what a scholar activist should be. Someone who's, not just thinking deep thoughts, but also actively fighting injustice.
Right. Putting those thoughts into action.
Exactly. And it's actually, it's kind of tragic when you remember that he was assassinated when he was only 38.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize he died so young.
Yeah. But even though he died young, his analysis in this book, I mean, it still holds up today. It basically shows how all those centuries of colonial exploitation are directly connected to the struggles that lots of African countries are still facing. Like, he draws a straight line between the past and the present.
So that's what we're going to be unpacking in this deep dive.
Yep. We're going deep on Rodney's main argument in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He basically takes us on a historical journey, starting all the way back in the 15th century and going right through to the end of colonialism.
Okay.
And the big question he's tackling is, how did Africa end up so economically underdeveloped compared to Europe?
And I guess why is it important to know this history, right? Like, what's the point of understanding all this?
Well, that's what Rodney gets at right from the start. It's not just about looking back for the sake of it. It's about understanding those roots so you can actually chart a path forward, a path towards real progress and independence for Africa.
I see.
Now, one thing he doesn't get super deep into in this particular book is the whole idea of neo-colonialism. But by showing us how the international capitalist system was set up, he's kind of laying the groundwork for understanding that too.
So sort of like the historical setup for what comes later.
Exactly. So let's get to, the heart of what Rodney's saying.
Yeah.
He gives us basically a two-part answer to this question of who's to blame for African underdevelopment. The first part, it's pretty straightforward. He points the finger right at the system itself, the imperialist system.
Makes sense.
He says that it was designed in a way that was basically meant to drain Africa of its wealth. And not just wealth in terms of, actual stuff being taken away, but also by blocking or stifling its natural development,
So like preventing Africa from reaching its full potential.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the second part of his answer, it gets a bit more, personal. He names names, so to speak.
Okay. So who does he call out specifically?
Well, first off, it's the obvious ones, right?
Yeah.
The European capitalists, those who are running the whole show, and later on, their American counterparts who kind of took over that role.
Right.
But then he takes it a step further, and this is where it gets interesting and maybe even a little uncomfortable. He suggests that even regular working people in those European countries, they benefited from this exploitation.
Yeah, that's definitely a more complicated idea.
Totally. He's saying that, look, even if they didn't realize it, their better wages, their better living conditions, those things were partly because of the cheap resources and wealth that was being pumped out of Africa.
I mean, when you put it that way, it really makes you think about, the bigger picture of how these systems work.
Absolutely. But, and this is crucial, Rodney isn't letting Africans off the hook entirely either.
Oh.
He makes it really clear that they also have a responsibility to understand how this system works and to fight against it. And that includes being honest about times when Africans might have, been complicit in this whole structure.
So it's not about placing blame. It's more about taking responsibility, I guess, on all sides.
Yeah, exactly. Now, one last thing before we really get into the weeds here. You can't really talk about this book without talking about Rodney himself.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, this wasn't just some academic theory for him. This was his life, He was deeply involved in activism. He even got kicked out of Jamaica for his work with the people there. And then, tragically, he was assassinated in Guyana while he was working for social change.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so his commitment to these ideas, it wasn't just theoretical. It was deeply personal, and that really comes through in how he writes.
Makes sense.
Okay, so now that we've got that context, let's dive into the actual argument. Rodney starts by defining development and underdevelopment, and his definition of development, it's pretty broad.
Okay.
He basically says it's about a society's growing ability to interact with their environment in ways that improve their lives, both materially and socially.
So it's not just about, having more stuff.
Right. He talks about both quantitative changes, producing more goods, and qualitative shifts, becoming more specialized in how work is done in society.
Yeah.
He even uses China's Tang dynasty as an early example of this kind of development, where they were flourishing economically and socially.
That's a good example. I mean, the Tang dynasty was known for its advances in art, literature, technology, all sorts of things.
Exactly. And then he contrasts that with underdevelopment, which he makes clear is not just about a society being like behind in some way. It's something that's actively caused by exploitation. It's when one society basically impoverishes another society on purpose, causing it to become poorer in relation to the exploiter.
So it's not about just being poor. It's about being made poor by someone else.
Precisely. And he also talks about why he chooses to use the term underdeveloped instead of like developing, which you hear a lot.
Yeah, I always wondered about that distinction.
He sees developing as problematic because it makes it sound like all these countries in, say, Africa, Asia, or Latin America are just kind of naturally on this path to catching up with the industrialized nations.
Right, like they're all on the same ladder, just at different rungs.
Exactly. But he argues that in reality, because these exploitative dynamics are still going on, even if they're not as obvious as they were during colonialism, the gap is actually widening. So they're becoming more underdeveloped compared to the powerful countries.
So it's like the goalposts keep moving further away.
Exactly. And he makes a really important point about where national wealth comes from in the first place.
Okay.
He challenges this idea that, paying your taxes is what creates a nation's wealth. He's like, no, that's not how it works at all. He says that wealth actually comes from people interacting with their environment, like extracting resources, and most importantly, the labor of the majority of the people.
Because, the farmers, the workers, they're the ones actually creating the wealth.
Right. Taxes are just a way to, manage that wealth, not create it.
It's about how it gets used.
Exactly. Now, Rodney then points out this huge paradox, right? He talks about how Africa is so incredibly rich in natural resources and has this incredible agricultural potential. But despite all that, it's so economically poor.
So the question is why? If it has all these resources, why is it still so underdeveloped?
And his answer is that you have to look outside of Africa to find the answer. It's not about some inherent deficiency within Africa itself. It's about this exploitative relationship that it's been locked into with developed countries.
It's about the way it's been treated by other, more powerful nations.
Exactly. And one of the biggest ways this exploitation has happened, he says, is through trade. He talks about how powerful countries have always set up the terms of trade to benefit themselves.
Okay.
Like, the classic example is that Africa mainly exports raw materials, like agricultural produce, but then has to import manufactured goods. So the more powerful countries basically control the prices on both sides.
Yeah.
They keep the prices of the raw materials low and then jack up the prices of the finished goods they sell back to Africa.
That's a pretty raw deal.
Right. It's a completely unequal exchange.
Okay, so having set up this whole framework of development and underdevelopment, Rodney then takes us back in time to look at what African societies were like before Europeans showed up. All right, so what does he say about that?
Well, first off, he challenges this, this very common and simplistic idea that it was just this static tribal Africa just waiting for Europeans to come and civilize it.
Yeah, that whole primitive Africa narrative.
Right. He throws that out the window. He says there was constant movement, constant change. African societies were evolving, and there were a lot of different types of social and political systems, from communalism to what he sees as early forms of feudalism in some areas.
So a lot more complexity than the simple stories often told about pre-colonial Africa.
Tons more. And he goes on to describe some of the features of African communalism. He talks about how labor was mostly organized around family units, resources were shared within communities, and elders had a lot of respect and authority, and this all worked, in those contexts.
It makes sense. Different systems for different times and places.
Absolutely. Now, he does say that some parts of Africa were shifting towards more hierarchical systems, kind of like early feudalism in Europe. He mentions places like Egypt, Ethiopia, the interlacustrine states of East Africa, and the empires of the Western Sudan. You start to see inequalities in land ownership, wealth, and the emergence of more powerful groups.
So more social stratification.
Yeah, but he's very clear that feudalism in Africa wasn't as widespread and was often mixed with elements of communalism.
So not just a direct copy of what was happening in Europe.
Right, it had its own unique character. And to prove that Africa wasn't just passively receiving influences from the outside, he showcases some of the technological advancements that were happening there.
Okay, like what?
Well, in agriculture, they had iron tools, terracing techniques, crop rotation, all that stuff.
Pretty sophisticated stuff.
And then in manufacturing, he talks about their textiles, their mining, and especially their metalwork. He even mentions the Ife and Benin bronzes, which date back to like the 14th and 15th centuries, as proof of their incredible skill.
I've actually seen those bronzes in a museum. They're absolutely stunning.
Yeah, they're amazing. And then he talks about how labor was organized, often based on kinship and community needs. He contrasts that with the more impersonal wage labor that developed under capitalism in Europe.
Yeah, makes sense.
Now, to give a clearer picture, Rodney gives us a bunch of examples of different pre-colonial African states.
Well, that sounds interesting.
He starts with Egypt, obviously. He talks about their advanced agriculture, their contributions to science. They even had windmills way back then, and their sophisticated trade networks. He actually says that at times Egypt was even more advanced than parts of Europe, and they were even teaching Europeans new things.
Wow, so the flow of knowledge wasn't always one way.
Exactly. Then he moves to the empires of the Western Sudan, like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. He talks about their agricultural base, how they were early adopters of iron technology, and their long-distance trade routes, especially across the Sahara Desert with gold and salt.
And those empires were incredibly wealthy and powerful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, for sure. They had complex political systems, rich cultures, and were even involved in mining copper and other resources.
It's amazing how much history is packed into these empires that we often just don't learn about.
I know, right? It's like a whole other world. And then he turns to Great Zimbabwe, which is known for those incredible stone structures.
Oh yeah, I've seen pictures of those. They're huge.
Massive. And he points out that building those structures required so much labor and organization, which shows they had a complex social structure and a lot of skill. He does mention, though, that they might have lagged behind in some areas, like textile production.
So development wasn't uniform, even within Africa.
Right, different regions had different strengths. Then he talks about the interlacustrine states in East Africa, like Buganda, Binyoro, and Rwanda. He explains how they developed centralized political systems, had pretty rigid social hierarchies, and even impressed the British with how efficient their administration was.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive considering the British were, well, not exactly known for praising other systems of government.
Exactly. He also mentions the Zulu kingdom and their military innovations under Shaka.
Oh yeah, he was a brilliant military leader.
Definitely. Rodney points out that all of this was happening before European colonialism really took hold. And he emphasizes that if Shaka hadn't been caught up in the slave trade, who knows what he might have achieved.
Yeah, it's a real tragedy to think about all the potential that was lost because of that horrific system.
Absolutely. Then, to round up this tour, he talks about the Kingdom of Dahomey in West Africa, which had a pretty complex political system, even with things like a census and a system of spies.
Wow, a census way back then.
Yeah. And he spent some time debunking all these crazy racist stories that Europeans spread about them being, like, super barbaric.
Right, because those stories were often just used to justify colonialism.
Exactly. And finally, before moving on, Rodney makes it clear that while slavery did exist in Africa before Europeans arrived, it was totally different from the kind of chattel slavery that they brought in, and it was not the main way that their economies worked.
That's a really important distinction to make.
Okay, so now Rodney gets to the really heavy stuff. The impact of the European slave trade.
Right, the turning point.
Yeah. He argues that the arrival of the Europeans with their expansionist capitalist system is what really messed things up.
Okay.
It basically threw a wrench in the works of African societies that were developing on their own.
And he argues that the slave trade was like a key part of that disruption, right?
Absolutely. It exploited existing problems and made them way worse, especially by playing different groups against each other to get more slaves.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah.
Classic colonial strategy.
Exactly. And he talks about how some African states, like Congo and Benin, they actually resisted the slave trade at first.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. But eventually, the pressure from Europe, the weapons, the goods, all that stuff, it was too much. They were basically forced to get involved.
I guess when you're up against a more powerful force, it's hard to hold out forever.
Totally. So then, Rodney goes through all the different ways that the slave trade messed up Africa's development.
Right. What are some of the key things he points out?
Well, first off, The huge population loss.
I mean, that's got to be one of the biggest impacts here.
Yeah. Millions and millions of people were taken away, and that's not even counting those who died in the process. It totally messed up their population growth and their ability to develop.
Just a staggering loss of human potential.
Absolutely. And then he talks about all the violence that came with it. The demand for slaves basically turned a lot of societies upside down.
Yeah.
They shifted away from productive stuff like farming or making things and focused on raiding and kidnapping.
Because that's where the profit was.
Exactly. He gives the example of the Gold Coast, where they basically went from mining gold to just like hunting people.
So the slave trade literally changed what their economies were based on.
Exactly. And even the areas that weren't directly involved in the slave trade, they still suffered because of the instability and violence it created.
It's like a ripple effect across the whole continent.
Exactly. Then he talks about how the slave trade messed up their economies in another way.
How so?
Well, before the Europeans came, Africa had its own manufacturing, especially in textiles.
Right.
But then cheaper European goods started flooding in, and it basically crushed those local industries.
Because they couldn't compete.
Exactly. So they ended up focusing on just exporting raw materials like cotton and importing finished goods from Europe. And this meant that they were always stuck in this unequal trade relationship.
Always dependent on Europe.
Exactly. And he gives the example of the Portuguese coming in and messing up the trade routes that already existed between the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast, just so they could benefit.
So they were actively working to undermine existing African trade networks.
Totally. And this whole thing, it made them dependent on those external markets, which could be super unstable.
So even if they were making some money, it wasn't really sustainable in the long run.
Right. Rodney uses the example of the ivory trade, which, yeah, it brought some wealth to certain groups, but it also made those groups super reliant on what was happening in Europe and Asia, where the demand was.
So it distorted their economies, making them focus on what outsiders wanted instead of what they needed themselves.
Exactly. And all of this, it meant that they couldn't really develop on their own terms. He points out that the Europeans got rich off this trade, but Africa didn't see those same benefits.
It's like they were stuck in this cycle of exporting their wealth and getting very little in return.
Totally. And finally, he gives this really sad example of Ibadan in Yorubaland.
Okay, what happened there?
They basically needed European guns to protect themselves because of all the violence that the slave trade created.
That's a messed up situation already.
Totally.
Huh.
And to get those guns, they had to sell more slaves, which meant they were weakening their own labor force and hurting their own agriculture. It's like this terrible feedback loop of underdevelopment.
Trying to survive in a system that's rigged against them?
Exactly. And Rodney's point is that Europe wasn't just developing on its own. It was actively using Africa to fuel its own rise.
Yeah, it wasn't just a coincidence that they were both happening at the same time.
Right. He talks about how all that trade, the slaves, the ivory, the gold, it all went straight into European pockets.
It was funding their growth.
Totally. It helped them build up their technology, expand their businesses, and basically create the whole capitalist system as we know it.
It's like the seed money for their global empire.
Exactly. And he dives into how the American colonies, especially up to the mid-19th century, were totally reliant on slave labor.
Right, the whole plantation system.
That's it. All that cotton, sugar, tobacco, it was all produced by enslaved Africans.
And generating huge profits for the Europeans.
Huge. And that wealth, it was driving economic growth in both the colonies and back in Europe, too.
It was the backbone of their economies.
Exactly. And this whole system, the triangular trade, it wasn't just about economics. It was about power. It was about Europe asserting its dominance on a global scale.
And the American colonies played a key role in that.
Absolutely. And Rodney argues that racism itself wasn't some natural thing. It was created to justify this whole system.
Yeah, I can see that. If you're going to treat people that way, you have to come up with a reason why they deserve it.
Exactly. He says that the economic exploitation happened first, and then they came up with racist ideas to make it seem okay.
To make it seem like it was the natural order of things.
Exactly. And he doesn't let Europe off the hook for their hypocrisy either.
What do you mean?
Well, they were all about freedom and democracy at home, but then they were doing this brutal exploitation overseas.
It's like they had two completely different sets of rules.
Right.
Yeah.
He even points out that, like, the American Constitution, which is supposed to be this document about freedom, it was written at a time when slavery was still in full swing.
That's a huge
A
contradiction.
major contradiction. And even the church was involved, so it wasn't just the government. Okay, so, moving on. Rodney gets to the era of formal colonialism, which, was basically the next phase of this whole system.
Right. From slavery to direct control.
Exactly. He explains that the technological and economic gap that had grown over centuries, partly because of the slave trade, it basically allowed Europe to just walk in and take over most of Africa in the late 19th century.
They had all the advantages at that point.
Totally. And it wasn't just, like, random aggression. He explains that it was driven by the internal logic of capitalism itself.
Okay. How so?
Well, they had all this wealth concentrated in Europe, but they needed more raw materials to feed their industries. Plus, they were always looking for new places to invest their money and make even more profit.
So Africa was basically the perfect target for their expansion.
Exactly. It had all these resources just waiting to be exploited.
Got like a gold mine for them.
Totally. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of military technology.
Right. Europe had a huge advantage there.
Huge. They had developed all these new weapons, like breech-loading rifles and, even more importantly, machine guns.
Like the Maxim gun?
Yeah. Those things were devastating, and they basically allowed small groups of Europeans to control huge populations.
So the conquest was made much easier by that technological gap.
Definitely. And Rodney, he completely rejects this idea that colonialism was like a favor to Africa or that they were doing it to civilize people.
Yeah, that whole white man's burden nonsense.
Exactly. He argues that colonialism was all about making underdevelopment even worse.
By stripping away any chance for Africa to develop on its own terms.
Exactly. They took away their political power, controlled their economies, and basically forced them to play by Europe's rules.
So any potential for independent development was crushed.
Crushed. He even gives examples of times when African leaders tried to modernize on their own.
Oh yeah, like what?
Well, there was King Gungunhana of Mozambique who wanted to get help from Switzerland with technology and medicine.
So trying to find partners outside of the traditional colonial powers.
Exactly. And then there was Muhammad Ali in Egypt, who was really pushing for modernization. But both of those efforts were basically sabotaged by European powers who saw them as a threat.
They didn't want any competition.
Nope. They wanted to keep Africa dependent.
I mean, it's all about maintaining power, right?
Totally. And they were smart about it, too. Rodney points out that they often used existing African political systems and even African troops to help them conquer and control the continent.
Playing different groups against each other.
Exactly. So once they had established colonial rule, the exploitation really ramped up.
Okay, how did that work?
Well, one of the key things was super cheap labor.
Right, because they needed workers for all their plantations and mines.
Totally. And they deliberately kept wages super low, so low that people basically couldn't survive without also farming for themselves.
So they were essentially subsidizing their own exploitation.
Exactly. And Rodney contrasts this with what was happening in Europe at the time, where workers were starting to get better wages and conditions.
So two different worlds.
Totally. And then there were these huge European trading companies, like the United Africa Company and others.
I've heard of those. They were like mini empires themselves.
Totally. They basically took control of big chunks of the African economy. They set the prices, controlled the markets, and sucked out all the profits.
Like middlemen on a massive scale.
Yeah, exactly. And then there were the shipping companies.
Oh, right. I bet they were making a killing too.
They were. They were mostly owned by the colonial powers, and they charged crazy high prices for transporting goods, which meant that African producers were getting squeezed even more.
So it wasn't just about what they were producing. It was about how much it cost to get it to market.
Exactly. And don't forget about the European banks.
Yeah, they were in on it too.
Oh, for sure. They mainly served the colonial governments and the European settlers, not the African population. And they made it easy to move money out of Africa and back to Europe.
So the profits were leaving Africa, not staying there to help it develop.
Exactly. And then there were all the policies that the colonial governments used to force people into working for them.
Yeah, like what?
Well, they imposed taxes that you could only pay in European currency, which meant you had to work for them to get the money.
So you were trapped in their system.
Totally. And then there was outright forced labor, which was especially bad in the Belgian Congo.
That was one of the most brutal colonial regimes.
Oh, for sure. It was horrific. And even seemingly well-intentioned things like the produce marketing boards, they actually ended up being another way to exploit people.
How so?
Well, they were supposed to help farmers by stabilizing prices, but what they really did was pay farmers really low prices for their crops. And then they sold those crops on the world market for way more.
So they were pocketing the difference.
Exactly. The profits went to the Europeans, not to the Africans who actually grew the food. So the picture that Rodney paints is one of massive exploitation, where wealth was constantly flowing out of Africa and into Europe.
Yeah, and he really emphasizes how systematic it all was.
Absolutely. But he goes even further, saying that it wasn't just about the money. There were all these non-monetary benefits that Europe got from colonialism, too.
Like, what else could they possibly take?
Well, think about it. It wasn't just about stealing resources. It was about using those resources to fuel their own development.
So, like, using those resources to advance their own technology and industry.
Exactly. He says that even though capitalism naturally pushes for innovation, colonizing Africa was like a huge boost.
Because it gave them all this cheap stuff to work with and a guaranteed market for their products.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the raw materials themselves. The whole process of getting those materials, transporting them, processing them, all of that, it forced them to come up with new ideas, new technologies, new ways of organizing things.
So it wasn't just taking, it was also about using that process of taking to develop themselves further.
Exactly. He even talks about how the competition between European powers to control colonies, it led to all sorts of military advancements.
Like a colonial arms race?
Kind of, yeah. And guess where they got a lot of the materials to make those weapons?
Africa.
Yep. And it's not just about, like, stealing ideas or materials. Rodney argues that colonialism helped shape the whole way that capitalism operates on a global scale.
So it wasn't just about what happened in Africa. It had ripple effects throughout the whole world.
Exactly. And to make it even more concrete, he gives specific examples.
Okay, what kind of examples?
Well, he talks about how all sorts of crucial African resources, things like palm oil, ground nuts, cotton, rubber, minerals like copper, manganese, chrome, all of that, it was feeding European industries.
Yeah.
And most importantly, uranium from the Congo.
Right, for the atomic bomb.
Yep, that too. He says that Africa basically helped to launch the age of electricity in Europe.
Wow. It's crazy to think about how much of our modern world is built on resources that were taken from Africa.
Totally. And it's not just about the raw materials themselves. He explains how processing those materials in Europe led to even more technological advancements.
Like they were constantly innovating based on what they were getting from the colonies.
Exactly. Like they figured out how to hydrogenate oils, they developed new detergents, all sorts of stuff. And all of that created jobs in Europe, raised their standard of living, all based on the exploitation of African resources.
It's like this whole chain of benefits that ultimately goes back to colonialism.
Exactly. And it gets even darker when he talks about how they used Africa as a testing ground for new military tactics.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, like during World War II, they developed a lot of their armored warfare techniques in North Africa. And the Italians used Ethiopia as a testing ground for their fascist tactics before the war even started.
So it wasn't just about economics. It was about using Africa for their own military advantage.
Right. And to make the connection to America even clearer, he talks about the rubber plantations in Liberia that American companies like Firestone set up.
Right, because rubber was crucial for the car industry.
Exactly. So America, even though it wasn't a major colonial power in Africa, it was still benefiting from this whole system.
Everyone was getting a piece of the pie.
Yeah. And finally, on this point, Rodney makes a really interesting connection between colonialism and the rise of fascism in Europe.
Okay, that sounds complicated.
It is, but it makes sense. He says that fascism, with all its ideas about racial superiority and domination, was kind of like a natural outgrowth of the logic of colonialism and capitalism.
Like the same impulses that drive colonialism also drive fascism.
Exactly. And he points to things like apartheid in South Africa and how French settlers in Algeria supported the Nazis during World War II as examples of how these ideas were connected.
So the line between colonialism and fascism is blurry, to say the least.
Very blurry. Okay, so now we have to talk about the impact of all of this on Africa itself.
Right, because it wasn't just about what Europe gained, it's about what Africa lost.
Exactly. And Rodney's point is that colonialism actively prevented Africa from developing in a healthy way.
So it wasn't just that they were extracting resources, it was also about preventing any kind of real progress.
Exactly. He talks about how there was this lack of real industrial development. Most of the towns that were built under colonialism, they were administrative centers, basically meant to control things and extract resources, not places where industries could flourish.
So they weren't set up for Africans to benefit from economic growth.
Right. This meant that most jobs were unskilled and unstable, and it led